The fog clung to the cobblestones of Eldridge Hollow like a shroud reluctant to release its grip, even as the first gray light of dawn pierced the spires of the old church. Dr. Elias Coldwell stepped from his carriage, his boots sinking into the damp earth at the edge of the village square. At 42, he bore the weight of his years in the precise lines of his face, sharp cheekbones, eyes the color of storm clouds, and a mouth that rarely curved into anything warmer than a clinician's assessment. He adjusted the brim of his hat against the chill, his breath visible in the crisp air, and made his way toward the modest surgery at the end of Willow Lane. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of carbolic acid and drying herbs, a sanctuary of order amid the village's creeping decay. Coldwell hung his coat on the peg by the door, his fingers lingering on the worn wool as if loath to shed the night's isolation. The surgery was his domain, shelves lined with jars of specimens, a scarred oak table for examinations, and a single lancet glinting under the lantern's glow. He had come to Eldridge Hollow 6 months prior, drawn by whispers of unexplained ailments, a rash here, a fever there, that the local apothecary dismissed as marsh vapors. But Coldwell knew better. Disease had patterns, and he intended to map them. A knock echoed through the room, sharp and insistent. Coldwell turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the scalpel on the side table, not out of fear, but habit, the tool and extension of his steady resolve. "Enter," he called, his voice even, betraying none of the fatigue from the sleepless journey. The door creaked open, admitting Thomas Hale, the young stable hand from the inn. At 19, Thomas was all gangly limbs and earnest freckles, his eyes wide with the urgency of youth. He clutched his cap in both hands, twisting it as if it might unravel his nerves. "Doctor, sir, it's Widow Hargrove. She's taken a turn. Worse than before. The rash, it's spreading, like ink bleeding through paper." Coldwell nodded once, slipping the scalpel into his pocket. Thomas had been his unofficial apprentice these past weeks, fetching supplies and holding lanterns during late-night calls. The boy was cautious to a fault, always hovering at the edges of procedures, his questions laced with a wit that bordered on irreverence. "Lead on, then," Coldwell said, grabbing his black bag. "And fetch the ether if you can manage it without spilling." They hurried through the mist-shrouded streets, the village stirring faintly, a dog barking in the distance, the creak of a shutter. Eldridge Hollow nestled in a fold of the moors, its thatched roofs sagging under perpetual damp, as if the land itself exhaled decay. The widow's cottage stood at the outskirts, its windows shuttered like closed eyes. Thomas pushed the door open, and the smell hit them first, not rot, but something sharper, metallic, like blood left too long in the air. Margaret Hargrove lay on her narrow bed, her skin pale as parchment under the threadbare quilt. In her late 50s, she had once been the village's seamstress, her fingers nimble with needle and thread. Now those hands clutched at the sheets, knuckles white. The rash began at her neck, a lattice of red lines that snaked down her collarbone, faint but insistent, as if etched by an unseen quill. Coldwell knelt beside her, his touch light as he parted the fabric of her nightgown. "It's burning, doctor," she whispered, her voice a rasp. "Like fire under the skin. And the dreams, letters, swirling, begging to be read." He met her gaze, noting the fever's glaze in her eyes. "No delirium yet, but close." "We'll see to it," he murmured, unpacking his instruments with practiced efficiency. Thomas hovered near the hearth, lighting a fresh candle, his face tight with worry. Coldwell had seen rashes like this in the city, smallpox variants, erysipelas, but this felt different, the lines too deliberate, almost scripted. As he cleaned the area with a tincture-soaked cloth, the widow winced, her breath hitching. The marks deepened under scrutiny, not blisters but incisions, fine as hairlines. Coldwell's pulse quickened, a rare flicker of intrigue piercing his composure. He selected the lancet, its blade catching the light. "This may sting, Mrs. Hargrove. But clarity demands precision." The cut was shallow, barely parting the epidermis. A bead of blood welled, dark and sluggish. But beneath, as he peeled back the flap of skin with forceps, something emerged, not infection, not suppuration, but ink. Faded, sepia-toned letters, scripted in a hand that curled like vines, "The Hollow knows your name." Coldwell froze, the room narrowing to that impossible revelation. Thomas leaned in, his breath catching. "What in God's name?" The widow's eyes fluttered shut, a sigh escaping her lips. Outside, the fog thickened, muffling the world beyond the cottage walls. Coldwell pressed a cloth to the wound, his mind racing through anatomical texts and forgotten lore. Skin as canvas. Absurd. Yet there it was, a message carved not by man, but inscribed from within. He straightened, signaling Thomas to help lift her. "We move her to the surgery. Now." The boy nodded, his usual quips silenced by the weight of what they'd uncovered. As they carried her into the dawn, Coldwell glanced back at the empty bed, the quilt stained with faint, inky smears. The hollow, it seemed, had secrets deeper than fog, and they were only beginning to bleed through. The lantern's flame flickered against the damp stone walls of the dissecting room, casting long shadows that danced like specters across the marble slab. Dr. Elias Coldwell adjusted his spectacles, the wire frame slipping slightly on the bridge of his nose as he leaned closer to the cadaver. The air hung heavy with the tang of formaldehyde and earth, the scent of a fresh grave still clinging to the body's linens. It was the third such specimen in as many nights, paupers pulled from the potter's field, their deaths unmarked and their forms unclaimed. Elias's hands, steady as always, parted the shroud with a practiced motion, revealing the pale expanse of the man's chest. His assistant, young Thomas Hale, hovered at the edge of the table, his face a mask of forced composure. Thomas was barely 20, fresh from the medical lectures at Guy's Hospital, with a mop of unruly brown hair and eyes that betrayed his rural upbringing, wide, watchful, like a colt sensing a storm. "Sir, the hour grows late," Thomas murmured, his voice barely above the drip of water from the ceiling. "The watchman will be round soon." Elias didn't look up. "The dead keep no appointments, Thomas. Nor do the secrets they carry." His scalpel glinted as he made the first incision, a clean line from sternum to navel. The skin parted smoothly, almost eagerly, as if relieved to yield its burdens. Blood, long congealed, smeared the blade, but Elias's focus remained on the layers beneath, muscle, fat, the quiet architecture of the human frame. He had always found solace in this work, a counterpoint to the chaos of the living wards upstairs, where fevered patients clawed at their sheets and begged for elixirs that did nothing. As the incision deepened, Elias paused. There, etched into the subcutaneous tissue, faint lines emerged, not the random marbling of veins, but deliberate strokes, curving like the tails of letters. He traced one with the tip of his instrument, careful not to disturb it. "Fetch the magnifier," he said, his tone even, though a chill prickled the back of his neck. Thomas complied swiftly, his boots scuffing the floor as he retrieved the brass device from a nearby shelf. Under the lens, the markings sharpened, not ink, but scars, old and healed, woven into the flesh like threads in a tapestry. "Letters," Thomas whispered, leaning in despite himself. But how? This man was a laborer, by the calluses on his hands. Who would? Elias silenced him with a raised finger. The forms resolved into words, Latin, fragmented, sub cute latet veritas. Beneath the skin lies truth. His pulse quickened, a rare intrusion into his clinical calm. He had heard whispers in the taverns near the Thames, tales of body snatchers inking their prizes or worse, cults marking the fallen with forbidden scripts. But this was no crude tattoo, these were incisions, healed over years, perhaps decades. The man's skin bore the weight of intention, as if his very body had been a palimpsest, written upon and erased, only to reveal itself under the knife. Probing further, Elias peeled back a flap of tissue. More emerged, a phrase, curling around the ribs, medicus curiosus occidit. The curious physician kills. A jest? A warning? The room seemed to contract, the shadows thickening as if the walls themselves inhaled. Thomas stepped back, his face paling. "Sir, we should stop. This isn't right." Elias's jaw tightened. He was no stranger to the macabre. His career had been built on pushing boundaries, from ether trials to galvanic experiments that left subjects twitching like marionettes. But this stirred something deeper, a curiosity laced with unease. Rightness is for theologians, Thomas. We deal in revelation. Yet as he sutured the flap closed, his fingers trembled faintly, not from fatigue, but from the dawning realization that this body, and perhaps others, had been chosen. Not random paupers, but vessels for a message meant for him. Outside, the wind howled through the narrow alleys of Southwark, rattling the iron-barred window. Thomas busied himself cleaning instruments, his movements jerky, while Elias recorded the findings in his ledger by lantern light. The words stared back from the page, mocking in their precision. As the church bells tolled 2, a distant knock echoed from the corridor, too deliberate for the watchman. Elias froze, scalpel still in hand, while Thomas's eyes darted to the door. The knocking came again, insistent, like fingers tapping on bone. The lantern's flame guttered in the draught seeping through the cracked window of the dissecting room, casting long shadows that clawed at the stone walls. Dr. Elias Coldwell wiped his bloodied hands on a rag, his breath steady despite the metallic tang in the air. The body on the slab belonged to Mrs. Harrow, a seamstress who'd collapsed in the market square 2 days prior, her skin pale as fresh linen even in death. He'd cut into her arm earlier that evening, following the faint ridge he'd noticed during the initial examination, a line too precise, too deliberate, to be a mere vein or scar. Elias leaned closer, his scalpel hovering. The incision revealed not muscle or sinew, but ink. Faded letters, scripted in a hand that resembled old parish records, etched directly beneath the dermis. Deus in machina, he murmured, tracing the words with the blade's tip. God in the machine. What heresy was this, hidden in flesh? Footsteps echoed from the corridor, sharp, hesitant. Elias straightened, glancing at the door. His assistant, young Thomas Wren, entered carrying a basin of water, his face gaunt under the brim of his cap. Thomas had been with him only a month, poached from the apothecary's lad, but his hands were steady for someone so green. Doctor, the watchman's making rounds. Should I douse the light? Not yet. Elias gestured to the arm. Look here. Tell me what you see. Thomas set the basin down and approached, his eyes widening as he peered at the exposed skin. The letters formed a phrase, incomplete, trailing off into the elbow's crook. He swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet room. It's writing. Like a tattoo, but deeper. Who would do such a thing? Elias didn't answer immediately. He'd seen tattoos before, sailors' anchors, soldiers' regimental marks, but this was different. The ink seemed fused, as if grown into the tissue, and the script wasn't English. Latin, perhaps, or something older. Mrs. Harrow had been a pious woman, attending Vespers every Sunday. Her husband claimed she'd never left the county. Yet here was this secret, carved into her very being. Fetch the magnifying glass, Elias said, his voice low. As Thomas rummaged in the cabinet, Elias probed further, peeling back a flap of skin. The letters continued, Edi revelabatur veritas sub cute. And the truth shall be revealed under the skin. A chill unrelated to the autumn damp settled in his chest. This wasn't self-inflicted, the edges were too clean, the pigmentation too uniform. Thomas returned, glass in hand. Sir, do you think it's contagion? Some disease marking her? Elias adjusted the lens, the words sharpening into focus. No, not a disease. This was deliberate, a message implanted. He recalled the whispers in the tavern last week, rumors of a traveling surgeon, a charlatan peddling cures in the villages, promising eternal secrets for a price. But Mrs. Harrow? She'd been hale until the end. A knock rattled the door, sharper than Thomas's steps. Elias froze, scalpel midway through another cut. Who is it? Reverend Hale, came the muffled reply, edged with impatience. The clergyman pushed in without waiting, his black coat swallowing the light. Hale was a fixture in the town, stern-jawed and unyielding, always meddling in matters of the flesh he deemed profane. "Dr. Coldwell, I've come for the body. The family wishes burial by dawn. No more of your probings." Elias lowered the blade, meeting Hale's gaze. The Reverend's eyes flicked to the slab, narrowing at the sight of the open arm. "What have you done to her?" "Discovered something extraordinary." Elias stepped aside, allowing Hale a view. Thomas hovered nearby, wringing his hands. Hale crossed himself, leaning in despite himself. His face paled as he read the exposed words. "Blasphemy. This is the devil's handiwork. Cover it at once." "It's not the devil," Elias countered, though doubt flickered in him. "It's human. Someone wrote this, hid it. And if it's in her, it might be in others." The Reverend straightened, his voice rising. "You tamper with God's creation, Coldwell. I've heard of your experiments. This town won't abide a vivisectionist playing at resurrection." Thomas interjected softly, "Reverend, we only seek to understand." "Silence, boy." Hale turned to Elias. "Bury her as she is, or I'll see your license revoked." Elias held his ground, the scalpel still warm in his palm. The room felt smaller, the shadows thicker, as if the words beneath the skin whispered back. He nodded curtly. "As you say. But mark me, Reverend, this truth won't stay buried." Hale departed with a final glare, the door slamming behind him. Thomas exhaled, slumping against the wall. "He'll stir trouble, sir. The magistrate listens to him. Let him." Elias resumed his work, slicing deeper into the forearm. More letters emerged, forming a name, Elias Coldwell. His own name, scripted in the dead woman's flesh. The scalpel slipped from his fingers, clattering to the stone floor. The lantern flame steadied, illuminating the impossible script. Thomas gasped, but Elias could only stare, the creeping certainty that this was no coincidence rooting him in place. Whatever force had inscribed these words knew him, had chosen him. And now, it watched. The lantern's flame guttered in the drafty confines of the dissecting room, casting elongated shadows that danced across the stone walls like specters fleeing judgment. Dr. Elias Coldwell wiped the bead of sweat from his brow, though the air hung chill and metallic, laced with the faint rot of formaldehyde and something sharper, fear, perhaps, or the echo of a scream long silenced. His scalpel hovered above the cadaver's abdomen, the skin already peeled back in precise folds, revealing the pale lattice of muscle beneath. It was the fourth body in as many nights, each one a vagrant pulled from the Thames' muddy embrace, their stories lost to the fog of London's underbelly. But this one, this poor soul with the ink-black hair matted against a pallid scalp, whispered secrets that no river could wash away. Elias's hand trembled, just once, before steadying. He was no stranger to the knife's cold kiss, years at St. Bartholomew's had honed his touch to an art. Yet as the blade parted the dermal layer with a whisper-soft slice, letters emerged, not tattoos, not scars from some sailor's folly, but words etched into the very subcutaneous tissue, as if the flesh itself had been scripted by an unseen quill. Eternal, it read in the first incision, the letters irregular, blooming red against the white fat. His breath caught, fogging the lens of his spectacles. He leaned closer, the lantern's glow illuminating the curve of an R that twisted like a vein. "God preserve us," murmured Thomas Hale, the young apothecary's assistant, from the corner where he clutched a basin of steaming water. Thomas was all wide eyes and fidgeting hands, his bravery a fragile thing, tested only by the petty thefts of the hospital's herb stores. He had insisted on staying, claiming loyalty, but Elias knew it was curiosity that chained him here, the same fatal lure that had drawn the doctor into this macabre unraveling. Is it the same as the others, sir?" Elias nodded without looking up, his voice a low rasp. "Worse. The script delves deeper this time. See here, the E intersects the fascia." He traced the edge with his forceps, careful not to disturb the fragile script. The previous cadavers had yielded fragments, a single word on the arm of the docker, watcher, faded as if dissolving, a phrase across the chest of the washerwoman, beneath the veil, curling like smoke. But this one promised a sentence, perhaps a revelation. The air grew thicker, the shadows coiling tighter, as if the room itself recoiled from the exposure. A floorboard creaked beyond the door, and both men froze. The hospital corridors were silent at this hour, the night watchman dozing in his alcove with a flask for company. Elias set down the scalpel, his heart pounding a staccato rhythm against his ribs. "Stay here," he whispered, rising to snuff the lantern halfway, plunging the room into a twilight of suspicion. He slipped to the door, easing it open on hinges that groaned like a dying breath. The hallway stretched empty, lit by a single gas lamp that flickered weakly, its flame bowing to an unfelt wind. Nothing. Just the distant drip of water from a leaking pipe, echoing like footsteps. Elias exhaled, turning back, but Thomas was already at the table, his face ashen under the dim light. "Sir, it's changing," the young man stammered, pointing with a trembling finger. Elias rushed forward, his coat brushing the edge of the slab. The letters, no, they weren't merely revealed, they seemed to shift, the ink of the flesh bleeding subtly, reforming. Eternal, blurred at the edges, the R elongating into something serpentine, coiling toward watcher, as if the words sought to connect, to weave a tapestry across the dead man's torso. "This isn't possible," Elias muttered, more to himself than Thomas. He pressed a gloved finger to the skin, feeling the unnatural warmth that lingered, defying the rigor that should have set in hours ago. The body was fresh, yes, but not this fresh, not pulsing faintly beneath his touch. A low hum filled the room, not from the walls or the wind, but from within the cadaver, a vibration that set his teeth on edge. Thomas backed away, knocking over a tray of instruments that clattered like bones in a grave. "We should stop, doctor. Burn it, or call the authorities." Thomas's voice cracked, his caution fracturing under the weight of the impossible. But Elias, ever the seeker, the man who had carved his way through cholera pits and typhus wards without flinching, shook his head. "No. This is knowledge, Thomas. Buried truths. If we flee now, they'll haunt us unfinished." He reignited the lantern fully, the light blooming harsh and unforgiving. The scalpel returned to his hand, steadier now, driven by a resolve that bordered on madness. As he incised deeper, peeling back the next layer, the words reformed, "Eternal watcher beneath the veil." And below that, emerging like a prophecy from the muscle's red depths, he sees through skin. The hum grew louder, a chorus of whispers that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Elias glanced up, catching Thomas's gaze, fear mirrored in both. Outside, the fog pressed against the window panes, thick as congealing blood, and for the first time, Elias wondered if the letters were a warning, or an invitation. The blade sank deeper, and the body sighed, as if exhaling a secret long held. The lantern's flame guttered in the draught seeping through the cracked window panes of the anatomy theater, casting jagged shadows across the marble slab where the body lay. Dr. Elias Coldwell leaned closer, his breath fogging the chilled air, as his scalpel traced a deliberate line along the cadaver's forearm. The skin parted like old vellum, revealing not the expected weave of muscle and sinew, but a faint, ink script curling beneath, letters that seemed to writhe in the flickering light, as if alive with some latent pulse. Elias paused, his gloved hand steady despite the tremor he felt building in his chest. 3 days had passed since the first discovery on the vagrant pulled from the Thames, and now this, the second body, a seamstress from the workhouses, bore the same cryptic markings. "Not tattoos," he murmured to himself, though he knew Thomas was listening from the corner, where the young assistant huddled over his notes. "These are embedded. As if the flesh grew around them." Thomas shifted, his chair scraping softly against the stone floor. He was a lanky lad of 19, all sharp angles and wide eyes, brave enough to handle the night's dissections but cautious when Elias's theories veered into the uncharted. "Sir, the coroner's report said she died of fever. Natural causes. What if it's just some sailor's mark, faded ink from years back?" Elias didn't look up. His blade hovered, then delved deeper, peeling back another layer. The script resolved into words, Latin, fragmented, sub cute latent veritas. Beneath the skin lies truth. A chill unrelated to the room's dampness prickled his neck. Natural causes don't etch scripture into a woman's veins, Thomas. This is deliberate. Surgical, perhaps. Or something else. The assistant rose, crossing the room with hesitant steps, his lantern held high to illuminate the slab. Elias had chosen him for this work not just for his steady hands, but for his wit, sharp enough to question without crumbling. Something else like what? Witchcraft. You're starting to sound like those broadsheet peddlers. Thomas's voice held an edge of forced levity, but his eyes darted to the door, as if expecting interruption from the night watchman. Elias straightened, wiping his blade on a linen cloth stained with the day's labors. The theater smelled of formaldehyde and river mud, a reminder of the body's origins, London's forgotten, washed up or carted in from the slums. He had always prided himself on his caution, the meticulous logs that kept his practice above the charlatan's trade. But these markings defied his catalogues, his texts from Vienna and Paris. Not witchcraft. Anatomy. Hidden. I've seen scars from illicit surgeries before, debts paid in flesh by back-alley cutters. But this, it's uniform. The same phrase on both. Thomas peered at the exposed arm, his face paling. Then who's doing it? And why her? The vagrant was a man, half drowned. No connection. Yet. Elias's mind raced, piecing the fragments. The seamstress's body had arrived that morning, her file noting erratic behavior in her final days, delirium, whispers of letters burning under the skin. He dismissed it as fever talk at first, but now. He turned to his satchel, retrieving the sketch from the first dissection, identical script, coiled like a serpent. We need more. The workhouse records. Discreetly. If this spreads, a knock echoed from the heavy oak door, sharp and insistent. Both men froze. The clock on the mantel struck 2, too late for legitimate visitors. Elias gestured for Thomas to stay back, his hand slipping to the pistol hidden in his desk drawer, a precaution in these shadowed halls, where body snatchers lurked as boldly as resurrection men. Who's there? Elias called, his voice even, betraying none of the knot tightening in his gut. The door creaked open a fraction, admitting a sliver of torchlight from the corridor. A figure slipped in, Margaret Hale, the nurse from the adjacent ward, her apron still dusted with the day's grime. She was the third in their small circle, cautious to a fault, her wit tempered by years of watching the dying unravel. Doctor. I overheard the porters. Another one, pulled from the docks tonight. Male, mid-30s. Complaining of itching under the skin before he collapsed. Elias exchanged a glance with Thomas, the air thickening with unspoken dread. 3 now. The pattern coalesced, a threat not of fever or flood, but of something carving its way through the city's underbelly. Show me, he said, already shrugging into his coat. The lantern flame steadied as he moved, but the shadows seemed to deepen, clinging to the walls like ink seeping from unseen wounds. They followed Margaret through the fog-shrouded alleys behind St. Bartholomew's, the gas lamps sputtering like dying stars. The new body lay in a makeshift morgue cart, covered by a tarpaulin that billowed in the wind off the Thames. Elias pulled it back, his scalpel ready, but even before cutting, he saw it, a faint bulge along the collarbone, as if the skin strained against buried words. Thomas lit a match, holding it close. Sir, look. It's moving. Not illusion. The flesh quivered, subtle as a vein's throb, but rhythmic. Elias pressed his fingers to it, feeling the warmth, not the cold rigor of death, but a faint, unnatural heat. The script beneath pulsed, letters forming in his mind's eye, Veritas te consumit. Truth will consume you. Margaret crossed herself, her caution cracking into quiet horror. We can't ignore this. If it's contagious, it's not disease, Elias snapped, though doubt gnawed at him. He incised quickly, the blade sinking too easily, and the skin folded back to reveal the full inscription, fresh as if inked that hour. Blood welled, darker than it should be, carrying a metallic tang that stung the eyes. Thomas recoiled. What now? We tell the authorities. The lantern's flame guttered in the draft seeping through the cracked windowpanes of the surgery, casting elongated shadows that danced like specters across the walls. Dr. Elias Coldwell leaned over the operating table, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. The patient, an anonymous vagrant pulled from the fog-shrouded alleys of Whitechapel, lay still under the weight of ether, his chest rising and falling in shallow rhythm. Elias had chosen him carefully this time, not for the usual ailments of the poor, but for the faint, unnatural markings that peeked from beneath the grime on his forearm. Markings that whispered of secrets buried deeper than flesh. He made the first incision with a scalpel honed to razor fineness, the blade parting skin as easily as parchment. Blood welled up, dark and sluggish, but Elias was prepared. He dabbed it away with linen soaked in carbolic acid, revealing the layer beneath. There, etched into the subcutaneous tissue, were letters, not scars from some crude tattoo, but deliberate script, as if inscribed by a hand steadier than any surgeon's. They formed words in a language Elias couldn't yet decipher, curling like vines around the man's veins. His breath caught. This was the third such case in as many weeks, each body yielding fragments of the same cryptic message. The first had been a drowned sailor, the second a fevered seamstress. Now this. A knock echoed from the door, sharp and insistent. Elias straightened, wiping his blade on a cloth. "Enter," he called, his voice muffled by the mask of oiled silk he wore against the ether's fumes. The door creaked open, admitting Thomas Hargrove, Elias's young assistant, his face pale in the dim light. Thomas carried a leather-bound journal under one arm and a lantern in the other, its glow merging with the room's own to banish some of the shadows. He was a cautious sort, always measuring his words, but tonight his eyes held a flicker of unease that mirrored Elias's own. "Doctor, the watchman from the docks, he's here. Says he found something washed up with the tide." "Another one, like the others." Elias nodded, not looking up from the table. He traced the letters with a gloved finger, committing their shape to memory. "Did he describe it?" "A bundle of rags, sir. But when they unwrapped it, there was skin, peeled clean, rolled like a scroll. Letters on it, just as you suspected." Thomas hesitated, setting the journal down. "The watchman swears it's human. Fresh." The air in the room thickened, the scent of blood mingling with the sharp tang of chemicals. Elias peeled back another layer of tissue, careful not to disturb the script. It spoke of rituals, of bindings, of something ancient stirring beneath the city's underbelly. He had begun this line of inquiry months ago, driven by a patient's dying confession of writings under the hide, but each discovery pulled him deeper into a web he couldn't fully see. The cost was mounting, sleepless nights, whispers from colleagues who called him obsessed, and now these bodies appearing as if summoned by his curiosity. "Prepare the preserving salts," Elias said, his tone even, though his mind raced. "We'll examine it here. And Thomas, lock the door behind you. No interruptions." Thomas complied, the bolt sliding home with a finality that echoed in the silence. He returned to the table, his movements precise but hurried, as if the room itself pressed in on him. As he mixed the salts in a basin, Elias continued his work, the scalpel gliding lower toward the man's abdomen. There, the letters grew bolder, forming what might have been a name, Elfric. It meant nothing to him, yet it sent a chill racing down his spine, as if the word had been waiting for him to uncover it. Outside, the foghorn moaned from the Thames, a low wail that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Elias paused, scalpel hovering. He thought of Eliza, his wife, waiting at their home in Bloomsbury with their infant son. She had begged him to abandon this morbid pursuit, her eyes shadowed with worry. But how could he, when the letters hinted at a plague long dormant, a curse etched into the very fabric of London's forgotten souls? The vagrant stirred faintly under the ether, a murmur escaping his lips, indecipherable, like the script itself. Thomas glanced up from the basin. "Doctor, do you think it's connected? The peelings, the markings, could it be some gang's mark, or worse?" Elias met his gaze, seeing the boy's bravery warring with fear. Thomas had been with him since medical school, loyal through the scandals and the doubts. "Worse," Elias replied softly. "Much worse. These aren't marks of men, Thomas. They're warnings." He resumed cutting, the blade whispering through flesh. As the incision deepened, a faint glow seemed to emanate from the exposed letters, not light, exactly, but a subtle luminescence, like phosphorescence in the deep sea. Elias's heart pounded. He had seen it once before, in the seamstress's arm, and it had faded by morning. But here, in the dead of night, it persisted, casting eerie reflections on the steel instruments. The watchman arrived shortly after, bundled against the chill, carrying the rolled skin in a burlap sack that dripped seawater onto the floorboards. He was a burly man named Wilkins, with a scarred face and eyes that darted nervously. "Found it tangled in the pilings, sir. Near where the old ships rot. Didn't touch it more'n I had to, gives a man the creeps." Elias unrolled the skin on a side table, the material unnaturally supple, as if not fully severed from life. Letters sprawled across it in jagged script, asterisk the carver awakens. Beware the ink of the veins, asterisk his mouth went dry. This was no coincidence. Someone, or something, was leaving these for him to find, piecing together a message from the bodies of the city's discards. Wilkins shifted uncomfortably. "You a doctor of the queer sort, then? Chasing ghosts?" The lantern's flame guttered low in the damp confines of the cellar, casting elongated shadows that clawed at the stone walls like desperate fingers. Dr. Elias Coldwell wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, the metallic tang of blood still thick in the air. The body on the slab, poor Mr. Hargrove, the miller who'd come to him with a persistent cough, lay splayed open, ribs pried apart like the covers of a forbidden tome. Elias's scalpel trembled slightly as he traced the faint lines emerging beneath the muscle, not scars or veins, but deliberate incisions, words etched in a script that twisted unnaturally, as if written by a hand from another world. He leaned closer, the acrid scent of formaldehyde mingling with something earthier, like soil after a grave-robbing rain. The letters spelled no English he recognized, yet they pulled at him, whispering promises of secrets long buried. "What devilry is this?" he muttered to himself, his voice echoing hollowly. Upstairs, the house creaked under the weight of the storm, but down here, time felt suspended, the only rhythm the drip of water from an unseen crack. Elias's assistant, young Thomas Hale, hovered at the foot of the slab, his face pale as fresh linen. Thomas was no stranger to the macabre, had held the lantern steady through countless autopsies, but tonight, his caution bordered on fear. "Doctor, we should seal him back up. The family expects a natural passing, not this." His words came out clipped, hands fidgeting with the edge of his apron. Elias ignored him, his brave curiosity overriding the knot of dread in his gut. He had always been the one to push boundaries, dissecting not just flesh but the veil between life and the unknown. With a steadying breath, he incised deeper, peeling back a flap of skin to reveal more of the script. It flowed like a river of ink under the dermis, characters coiling around the heart's chamber. As the lantern light hit it fully, the lines seemed to shimmer, not with moisture, but with an inner glow, faint as foxfire in a bog. A low rumble shook the cellar floor, dust sifting from the beams overhead. Thomas stumbled back, knocking over a jar of specimens that shattered in a spray of brine and bone fragments. "Earthquake," he gasped, but Elias knew better. The tremor came from within, a vibration humming through the slab, through Hargrove's corpse, syncing with the beat of his own pulse. "Steady, lad," Elias said, though his voice wavered. He pressed his fingers to the exposed script, and a chill raced up his arm, not cold, but a probing violation, as if invisible eyes scanned his thoughts. Visions flickered at the edge of his mind, shadowed figures in a lantern-lit chamber, carving their own pleas into flesh, begging for release from some eternal binding. Hargrove hadn't been marked in life, this was done after, by hands that knew the body's hidden canvas. Thomas edged toward the stairs, his wit deserting him in the face of the unnatural. "Sir, if this spreads, if it's contagious, we'll both end up like him, words under our skin, screaming silent." But Elias waved him off, his focus narrowing to the emerging phrase beneath the lungs, a warning, perhaps, or an invitation. He couldn't stop now, the challenge of it gripped him tighter than any fever. The rumble built again, stronger, rattling the instruments on the tray. Elias's scalpel slipped, nicking his thumb, and blood welled up, dark, too dark. He watched in horror as the droplet hit the script, and the lines absorbed it, pulsing once, twice, like a vain awakening. The air grew heavy, pressing down, and from the depths of the body rose a whisper, not sound but sensation, curling into his ears, "Release us, physician, or join the etched." Thomas bolted then, his footsteps pounding up the stairs, leaving Elias alone with the awakening dead. The doctor straightened, resolve hardening against the creeping dread. He would read it all, uncover the right that bound these souls to skin. But as the script began to writhe, spelling his own name in faint relief, he wondered if the cost would be his own unmarked flesh. The storm above raged on, indifferent, while below, the true tempest stirred. The lantern's flame guttered in the draught seeping through the infirmary's cracked walls, casting elongated shadows that clawed at the edges of Dr. Elias Coldwell's vision. He leaned closer to the operating table, his scalpel hovering above the cadaver's abdomen, a vagrant pulled from the Thames fog 2 nights prior, his skin pale as river silt. The air hung heavy with the tang of carbolic acid and something sharper, like ink left too long in the sun. Elias's hands, steady as always, betrayed him with a faint tremor. The letters he'd uncovered beneath the last subject's dermis still whispered in his mind, fragments of a language that twisted like veins under pressure. "Steady now," murmured his assistant, young Thomas Hale, from the corner where he clutched a ledger. Thomas's voice was a thin thread in the room's oppressive quiet, his eyes wide behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He was the cautious one, always tallying risks before Elias dared the blade, but tonight his caution felt like chains. The board's inspectors could arrive any hour. If they find we've deviated again. Elias didn't look up. They'll find progress, Thomas. Or nothing at all. The scalpel bit in, a precise incision along the sternum, parting flesh with a sound like tearing wet paper. Blood, long congealed, smeared the blade, but beneath it, there, etched into the subcutaneous layer as if by some mad engraver, emerged the first curve of a symbol. Not scars, not tattoos, these were deliberate, inscribed with a precision that mocked human frailty. The symbol resolved into a looping glyph, reminiscent of alchemical sigils from forbidden texts Elias had pored over in his youth, back when medicine was more art than science. Thomas edged forward, his boots scuffing the sawdust-strewn floor. "It's like the others. But deeper this time. What if it's not natural? What if—" a low rumble echoed from the corridor beyond the door, not thunder but something mechanical, grinding like the wheels of a cart overloaded with stone. The infirmary, tucked in the bowels of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, rarely saw such disturbances at this hour. Elias paused, the scalpel poised, as the rumble grew, vibrating through the table and into his bones. Dust sifted from the rafters, and the lantern swung wildly, shadows leaping like specters. "Lock the door," Elias hissed, his voice low but edged with the authority that had silenced skeptics in lecture halls. Thomas obeyed, fumbling with the iron bolt, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The rumble peaked, then resolved into footsteps, heavy, deliberate, approaching. Elias covered the cadaver with a stained sheet, but not before committing the glyph to memory, a circle bisected by thorns, enclosing what might have been an eye. The door rattled under 3 sharp knocks. "Dr. Coldwell?" "It's Warden Graves from the watch." The voice was muffled, authoritative, laced with the gravel of too many nights patrolling Whitechapel's alleys. Elias exchanged a glance with Thomas, who had gone pale as the corpse between them. Graves wasn't one for social calls. Rumors swirled that he hunted more than thieves these days, whispers of bodies vanishing from the morgue, of men marked by unseen hands. Elias straightened his frock coat, wiping the scalpel on a rag before slipping it into his pocket. "Enter," he called, his tone even, betraying none of the dread coiling in his gut. The door creaked open, admitting a burly figure in oilskin cape, lantern in hand, flanked by two constables whose faces were half lost in the brim of their helmets. Graves' eyes, sharp as flint, swept the room, lingering on the shrouded table. "Evening, Doctor. Apologies for the intrusion, but we've reports of irregularities. A patient from the docks, seen entering your ward, never emerged. And now this fog, it's carrying more than mist tonight." Graves stepped closer, his gaze fixing on the sheet where a faint reddish stain bloomed. The air thickened, the rumble from earlier echoing faintly again, as if the city itself groaned under some buried weight. Elias forced a measured smile, his mind racing through the glyphs he'd unearthed over weeks, messages in flesh, pieced from the unclaimed dead, hinting at a conspiracy older than the hospital stones. Letters beneath skin, addressed to no one, or perhaps to him. "Irregularities are my trade, Warden. What precisely troubles you?" Graves' hand rested on his truncheon. "Troubles me? A man carved like a cipher, found floating with your name etched into his ribs. They say you're playing God down here, Doctor. And God's not forgiving." Thomas shifted behind Elias, his fingers twitching toward the ledger, but Elias raised a hand to still him. The dread crept deeper now, not from the warden's words, but from the realization that the next glyph might bear his own name. Outside, the fog pressed against the windowpanes like a living shroud, and in its depths, Elias swore he saw shapes moving, figures with skin too smooth, too unmarked, watching. The scalpel burned in his pocket, a promise and a curse, as the ruined shadows seemed to lean in, hungry for the truth buried beneath. The lantern's flame guttered in the draught seeping through the cracked windowpanes of the anatomy theater, casting elongated shadows that danced like specters across the marble slab. Dr. Elias Coldwell leaned closer, his scalpel hovering above the pale expanse of the cadaver's abdomen. The air hung heavy with the tang of formaldehyde and something sharper, decay's insistent whisper. His hands, steady as ever despite the tremor in his soul, parted the flesh with deliberate precision. There, beneath the layers he'd peeled away like the pages of a forbidden book, the letters gleamed faintly, etched in a script that seemed to pulse with an unnatural vitality. "Another one," murmured Thomas Hale, his assistant, from the corner where he clutched a leather-bound journal. Hale's voice was a threadbare whisper, his usual boyish curiosity frayed by weeks of this unrelenting horror. He was the cautious one, always measuring risks with a merchant's eye, yet here he stood, unwilling to abandon the man who'd pulled him from the gutters of Whitechapel. "But the pattern, it's shifting, Doctor. These aren't prayers anymore. Look at the curves, they're curling inward, like they're trying to hide." Coldwell didn't respond at first. His breath fogged the lens of his spectacles as he traced the inscription with a gloved finger. The words formed no coherent tongue he recognized, no Latin incantation, no biblical verse, but they stirred a dread that coiled in his gut, deeper than any fever he'd ever diagnosed. The previous nights had worn him thin, the break-in at his surgery, the anonymous letters warning him to cease his blasphemous excavations, and now this third body in as many days, delivered anonymously to the back alley with a note pinned to its shroud. The challenge wasn't just the mystery, it was the cost. Hale's sister had fallen ill last week, her skin mottling with faint, shadowy marks that no poultice could erase. Coincidence? Coldwell's rational mind rebelled, but the evidence mounted like frost on a window. He straightened, wiping the blade on a stained cloth. The theater's high ceilings amplified the scrape of metal on fabric, echoing as if the dead themselves were listening. "We press on," Coldwell said finally, his tone earnest, laced with the quiet resolve that had carried him through cholera wards and battlefield amputations. Brave, they called him in the medical societies, foolhardy, perhaps, but never one to shy from the body's secrets. "If these markings are a map, or a warning, we can't stop now. Fetch the ink and the tracing paper. We'll document it before the watch makes their rounds." Hale hesitated, his wiry frame tensing under the threadbare waistcoat. The external threat loomed larger than the inscriptions, Inspector Hargrove and his constables, sniffing about the rising tally of unclaimed bodies vanishing from the paupers' graves. Rival anatomists whispered of Coldwell's unethical procurements, but it was Hargrove's grudge that bit deepest, a man soured by the doctor's refusal to falsify a coroner's report years ago. Last night's confrontation in the fog-shrouded streets had ended with a shove and a snarled promise, one more corpse without provenance, Coldwell, and I'll have you in irons. As Hale unrolled the paper, a low rumble shook the floorboards, the rumble of carriage wheels on cobblestones outside, too deliberate for a late-night dray. Coldwell's pulse quickened. He doused the lantern with a swift motion, plunging the room into inky blackness broken only by the pallid moonlight filtering through grimy glass. Quiet, he breathed, drawing Hale behind a curtain draped over dissecting tables. The door to the theater creaked open, hinges protesting like a wounded animal. Footsteps echoed, heavy, purposeful. Not Hargrove's measured tread, but something clumsier, accompanied by the scrape of boots on stone. A voice cut the silence, rough as gravel. He's here, I tell you. Saw the light from the alley. Two figures, by the sound, burly men, perhaps from the Resurrectionists' Guild, or worse, Hargrove's informants turned enforcers. The beam of a bullseye lantern swept the room, illuminating the slab where the cadaver lay exposed, its secrets bared. Coldwell's mind raced. The early plan, to sketch the markings and slip away before dawn, had backfired spectacularly. They'd been too slow, too absorbed. Now, the risk sharpened, not just exposure, but the loss of the body, the evidence. Hale's hand gripped his arm, a silent plea, but Coldwell shook it off. He reached for the scalpel, its edge catching a sliver of light. No speeches, no grand gestures, just action, born of necessity. In the shadows, he waited, the inscriptions on the dead man's skin seeming to writhe as if alive, urging him toward a choice that could unravel everything. The intruders drew nearer, their lantern's glow creeping across the floor like a predator's gaze. Coldwell's breath steadied, the adventure had turned perilous, but retreat was no longer an option. The lantern's flame guttered in the draught seeping through the cracked window panes of the old surgery, casting jagged shadows across the dissecting table. Dr. Elias Coldwell wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve, his hands steady despite the tremor that had begun to haunt his sleep. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the faint, acrid bite of carbolic acid, but beneath it all lingered something else, a whisper of decay, as if the room itself were exhaling secrets long buried. Before him lay the body of Margaret Hale, the third patient in as many weeks whose skin had yielded the impossible. He had incised carefully along the abdomen, peeling back the layers with the precision of a man unwrapping a forbidden gift. And there, etched not in ink but in the very weave of subcutaneous tissue, were the letters, "Beware the hand that heals, for it invites the void." They formed a spiral, faint and irregular, as if clawed into the flesh from within. Elias stepped back, his breath catching. This was no mere anomaly, no trick of post-mortem settling or some obscure dermal condition. The words were deliberate, ancient in their phrasing, and they matched the fragments he'd uncovered in the others, phrases that twisted together like roots seeking light. His assistant, young Thomas Wren, hovered at the edge of the table, his face pale under the fringe of ginger hair, eyes wide with the mix of awe and revulsion that had become his constant expression. "Doctor," Thomas murmured, his voice barely above the drip of rainwater from the eaves outside, "this one, it's clearer than the last. As if it's trying to say more." Elias nodded, not trusting his voice yet. He had dismissed the first discovery as coincidence, a patient's hidden tattoo, faded and distorted by illness. The second had shaken him, forcing him to pore over medical texts late into the night. But this? This demanded action. The letters weren't just markings, they pulsed faintly under his fingertips, warm where the surrounding flesh had cooled to the chill of death. He glanced at the door, half expecting the constabulary to burst in, summoned by whispers in the village that the good doctor was meddling with the unholy. "We burn the records tonight," Elias said finally, his tone clipped, authoritative. Thomas blinked, his cautious nature surfacing in the furrow of his brow. "Burn them?" "But sir, if this spreads," if the board of physicians hears, it will spread, Elias interrupted, leaning closer to the body. His scalpel hovered, tracing the air above the spiral without touching. These aren't accidents, Thomas. They're warnings. Or invitations. And if we don't understand them, the next body on this table might be ours. The wind howled then, rattling the shutters like bony fingers. Elias had always prided himself on his rationality, his dissections a bulwark against the superstitions that gripped 1841's fog-shrouded England. Yet here, in the dim glow, doubt crept in. The patients, poor souls felled by a wasting fever sweeping the moors, had come to him in desperation, their skin mottled and fever-hot. He'd cut to save them, only to find the letters blooming beneath, as if the disease itself were literate. Thomas shifted, his wit subdued by the hour. Perhaps it's the laudanum. Hallucinations bleeding into the flesh. Or that charlatan herbalist in the village, peddling his cursed poultices. Elias shot him a sharp look. No poultices explain this. He pressed the blade down, extending the incision toward the chest. The skin parted with a wet sigh, revealing more. The physician's touch awakens the sleeper below, the words curled upward, toward the heart, which lay still and dark. A sudden knock echoed from the front room, 3 sharp raps, insistent. Elias froze, the scalpel slipping from his grip to clatter against the tray. Thomas's eyes darted to the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the poker by the hearth. Who calls at this hour? Elias whispered, though he knew. Inspector Hargrove, the rival from the county constabulary, had been sniffing around since the second death, his questions laced with accusation. Hargrove, ever the cautious bulldog, suspected foul play, poison, perhaps, or worse. If he saw this. The knocking came again, harder. Elias gestured for Thomas to stay put, then moved silently to the adjoining chamber, grabbing his coat from the hook. He cracked the door to the surgery, peering into the narrow hallway lit only by a dying candle. Dr. Coldwell. Hargrove's voice boomed, muffled by the wood. Open up. We've reports of screams from your quarters. Lies, Elias thought, his mind racing. No screams, only the wind and their hushed words. But Hargrove's persistence was no bluff, the man had a nose for irregularity, and the village tongues wagged freely now. One moment, Elias called, his voice steady as he barred the surgery door behind him. He met Hargrove in the parlor, the inspector's frame filling the doorway like a storm cloud. Behind him, 2 constables loomed, lanterns swinging. Evening, Doctor, Hargrove said, his eyes narrowing under bushy brows. Mind if we take a look around? Complaints of unnatural noises. Elias forced a smile, brave in the face of the intrusion. Unnatural? In a physician's home? Surely you jest, Inspector. I've been tending to records, tedious work. Hargrove stepped inside uninvited, his boots thudding on the floorboards. Records of what? More of those fever cases. The ones where the dead don't stay buried in peace. The words hung, a veiled threat. Elias's pulse quickened. Hargrove knew something, or suspected enough to press. In the surgery, Thomas would be concealing the body, draping it hastily, but one wrong glance. Merely anatomy, Elias replied, guiding him toward the empty consulting room. Nothing to alarm the parish. But as Hargrove's gaze swept the shadows, Elias felt the weight of the letters pressing on him, invisible yet insistent. The lantern's flame guttered low in the damp confines of the cellar, casting elongated shadows that clawed at the stone walls like desperate fingers. Dr. Elias Coldwell knelt beside the operating table, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest, the scalpel hovering above the pale expanse of Mrs. Harrow's forearm. She lay there, not quite unconscious, her breaths shallow and ragged, eyes half-lidded as if peering into some abyss only she could see. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the faint, acrid bite of ether, but beneath it all lurked something else, a whisper of decay, as if the very walls exhaled secrets long buried. He had cut into her before, in the dim hours after midnight, driven by the compulsion that had gripped him since that first revelation on the vagrant's corpse. Letters, etched not in ink but in the subdermal layers, forming words that twisted the mind. Beware the hand that writes in flesh. Mrs. Harrow, the widow from the East Wing, had come to him with a rash that wouldn't heal, her skin mottling like old parchment. But when he peeled back the layers, there they were again, symbols coiling beneath, not random scars but a deliberate script, archaic and insistent. The physician sees what the soul hides, his fingers itch to trace them, to decipher the pattern that seemed to shift under scrutiny, as if alive. "Doctor," she murmured, her voice a dry rasp that echoed off the vaults. "It burns, deeper now." Her hand twitched toward him, fingers curling like hooks, but he pressed it back with a gentleness that belied the storm in his eyes. Elias had always been the careful one, the surgeon who mended fractures in the flickering light of gas lamps, his wit a shield against the grim realities of the infirmary. But caution had eroded these past weeks, worn away by the parade of patients whose skins yielded the same cryptic missives. The apothecary's boy, the miller's wife, each incision revealed fragments of a larger text, piecing together warnings that spoke of a covenant, a curse woven into the fabric of the body itself. He made the cut, precise and shallow, the blade whispering through epidermis like a confidant. Blood welled, dark and viscous, but he ignored it, dabbing with gauze until the underlayer gleamed. There, the letters emerged, faint at first, then bolding into view as if inked by an invisible quill. The carver becomes the carved. Elias's breath caught, the words forming a sentence that linked to the others he transcribed in his hidden ledger. His heart pounded, a rhythm that matched the distant drip of water from the ceiling, each drop a countdown. The challenge wasn't the surgery anymore, it was the rival force at work, this unseen hand inscribing fates beneath the skin, turning his blade against him. One patient had woken mid-procedure, clawing at his face with screams of "it writes through you," and Elias had bandaged the wounds, but the doubt lingered like a fever. Footsteps echoed from the stairs, cautious, deliberate. It was Thomas, his assistant, the young man whose bravery had kept Elias grounded through the long nights. Thomas carried no tray of instruments this time, only a lantern of his own, its light spilling golden across the threshold. "Sir, the constables are at the gate again. They say another body washed up by the docks, marked the same way." His voice held steady, but his eyes darted to Mrs. Harrow, then to the fresh incision, where the letters seemed to pulse faintly, as if breathing with her. Elias straightened, wiping the blade on his apron, the metallic gleam catching the light like a promise of retribution. "Let them wait. This one confirms it." He gestured to the exposed script, his witty deflection gone, replaced by the raw edge of obsession. Thomas stepped closer, peering at the markings, his face paling as recognition dawned. They'd argued before, Thomas urging caution, Elias pushing forward with the fervor of discovery. But tonight, the plan that had sustained them, methodical dissections to map the curse, backfired in the worst way. As Thomas leaned in, a drop of Mrs. Harrow's blood spattered his cuff, and he recoiled, rubbing at it furiously. "It's spreading, isn't it? Not just on them, on us." The widow stirred then, her eyes snapping open fully, pupils dilated to black voids. "Read it aloud," she demanded, her tone shifting from frailty to command, as if the letters had loaned her a voice from beyond. Elias hesitated, the scalpel heavy in his grip, but the words tumbled out anyway. "The hand that reads seals its own." A chill seeped through the stones, the lantern flames dipping in unison, plunging the room into momentary gloom. Thomas grabbed Elias's arm, his grip iron. "We stop this now. Burn the ledger, seal the wounds, before it carves us next." But Elias pulled away, the conflict etching lines deeper into his face. The external threat wasn't the lawmen outside or the bodies piling in the morgue, it was this insidious script, a resource of knowledge that starved them of sanity with every revelation. He sutured the incision swiftly, the needle flashing like a comet's tail, but as he tied the final knot, a faint itching bloomed under his own sleeve. He glanced down, pushing the fabric up just enough to see, a single letter forming on his wrist, pale and insistent, E. The cellar door creaked wider, admitting a draft that carried the murmur of voices from above. Thomas moved to block it, his stance protective, but Elias knew the adaptation they needed wasn't flight or fire. It was understanding the writer, facing the cost of what lay beneath. As Mrs. Harrow's breathing steadied into uneasy sleep, the doctor traced the mark on his skin, the weight of the unfinished text pressing like an unseen hand. The night stretched on, the shadows lengthening, and with them, the creeping certainty that the final chapter was carving itself into them all. The lantern's flame guttered low in the damp confines of the cellar, casting elongated shadows that clawed at the stone walls like the fingers of the damned. Dr. Elias Coldwell's hands trembled as he set down the scalpel, its blade still slick with the residue of his final incision. The air hung heavy with the metallic tang of blood and something fouler, an undercurrent of decay that seemed to seep from the very earth beneath them. Beside him, young Thomas Hale, his assistant, pressed a cloth to his own gashed forearm, his face pale but resolute, eyes fixed on the body laid out on the scarred oak table. The patient, no, the vessel, had been Margaret Ellis, a washerwoman from the docks whose unexplained seizures had drawn Coldwell's curiosity months ago. Now, her skin lay peeled back in meticulous folds, revealing not muscle and sinew, but a lattice of etched script, words that writhed like living tattoos under the flickering light. They were letters, ancient and deliberate, spelling out fragments of a covenant. In flesh we bind, in blood we wake. Coldwell had carved deeper with each surgery, chasing the source, convinced it was a medical anomaly, a dermal affliction born of some forgotten plague. But the deeper he went, the more the words multiplied, bleeding ink that wasn't ink at all. "It's over," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking like thin ice. He had argued against this final descent into the cellar, pleading that the inscriptions were no natural malady but a curse, unearthed from the old burial grounds where the table had been salvaged. Coldwell had dismissed him then, his caution eroded by obsession. Now, as the last flap of skin fell away, exposing a cavity where organs should have been, a hollow chamber lined with pulsating script, regret coiled in his gut like a serpent. The chamber pulsed. Not with life, but with rhythm, as if the words themselves breathed. Coldwell leaned closer, his breath fogging the air, and traced a finger along the edge. The script responded, glowing faintly, letters rearranging into a new phrase. "He who reads shall join." A chill raced up his arm, and he yanked back, but too late, the glow spread, seeping into his skin like dye through cloth. Thomas lunged forward, knocking the lantern askew. It clattered to the floor, spilling oil that ignited in a whoosh, flames licking at the table's legs. "We burn it," he shouted, grabbing a bellows from the wall and pumping air into the blaze. The fire caught the desiccated edges of the exposed cavity, and the script recoiled, the glow dimming as acrid smoke billowed up, carrying whispers, indistinct at first, then forming pleas in Margaret's voice, or what had once been hers. Coldwell staggered back, clutching his arm where the ink now bloomed beneath his sleeve, faint lines tracing the veins. He tore at the fabric, revealing the first letters. Elias, it was his name, scripted in the same archaic hand. Panic surged, but he forced it down, his physician's mind grasping for adaptation. The fire was their clever turn, a desperate sterilization against the unknown contagion. He seized a vial of carbolic acid from his kit and hurled it into the flames, the liquid exploding in a hiss of steam and sharper stench, accelerating the inferno. Margaret's form, or what remained, twisted unnaturally as the fire consumed it, the script charring and flaking away like burning parchment. The whispers crescendoed, a chorus of voices from beneath the skin, echoing the covenant's promise. Thomas coughed, shielding his eyes, but held the bellows steady, fanning the blaze until the table groaned under the heat. Coldwell joined him, using a poker to prod the remains, ensuring nothing escaped the pyre. As the last embers died, leaving only ash and twisted bone, the cellar fell silent save for their ragged breaths. Thomas slumped against the wall, his wound bandaged hastily, the blood seeping through. "It's done," he said, but his eyes darted to Coldwell's arm, where the script had faded to a whisper of scars, marks that would never fully heal. Coldwell nodded, pulling his sleeve down, the weight of the night's cost settling like lead in his chest. The docks above would buzz with rumors of the washerwoman's vanishing, and his practice would suffer, patients shying from the doctor who delved too deep. He had saved Thomas from the Hollow's grasp, their teamwork forged in the crucible of flame, but the letters lingered in his flesh, a quiet reminder that some bindings could not be severed clean. In the years to come, he would treat fevers and fractures with steady hands, but at night, when the house creaked, he would feel them stir, faint itches beneath the skin, waiting for the next reader to carve too close.